I'm going to kick off today by just reminding some of you of the key messages in terms of what's the impact of the directive on the alternatives industry in Jersey. What I'm going to start with doing is just reminding some people about how we're working towards the right solution for Jersey. I think what's unique about Jersey is how government, regulator, industry have actually come together since April, May 2009 and worked through this, reaching outside the island in terms of trying to decide what is the right strategy in responding to AIFMD. We're going to rattle through very quickly then what are the main elements of the AIFMD that people need to be aware of in terms of accessing the EU institutional investors. One of the things we've been involved with as well as a firm with JerseyFinance is looking at the impact of the directive on the various structures that are deployed on the island. And we'll touch on that. And last but not least, we'll just remind everybody of what we believe the strategic advantages of the Jersey-based funds are and managers. The purpose behind the AIFMD strategic plan as such in terms of what we do next was really to protect the business that we currently have on the island, but also to look at new opportunities to market ourselves into Europe. Interestingly enough, I think what we're seeing already is certain asset managers looking at Jersey and Guernsey, dare I say that, with some of my Guernsey colleagues here today, in relocating out of Europe into the islands. And I was at a meeting yesterday where two large private equity groups will be coming out of Europe into the offshore islands in the coming months because of AIFMD. But clearly what we need to do is make sure we protect what we have and get some clear messages out there and make sure whatever strategic actions we follow through on actually resonate with users of the island. So in terms of making sure that the next steps from a Jersey perspective are the right steps, one of the things we decided to do earlier this year was actually reach out to asset managers, alternative asset manager advisors based outside the island, either using the island at the moment or intending to use the island, and to make sure that whatever we decide to do in terms of providing an AIFMD compliant product is actually appropriate for them. We looked at structuring a survey using our Belfast International Survey Unit in terms of how we position the questions. We selected about 25 to 30 top alternative asset managers in Europe. And then various individuals actually completed those surveys through face-to-face dialogue. I think it was another way of actually reinforcing through that dialogue that Jersey is actively engaged on this topic. So what did they say? Well, first of all, how representative were the responses that we actually received? In terms of the assets advised by these managers, or these advisors rather, $238 billion under management, and a fairly broad cross-section of alternative asset advisors as well. So you see we covered all subsectors of the alternative management industry. The first question was, have you actually completed an AIFMD impact analysis? I would say probably in July, August, when James and myself were doing this type of work in the UK, very few people had actually completed an impact analysis. 65% of those responding had actually looked at AIFMD in terms of what it meant for their product and their future. The other question we asked was whether they would look to replace offshore products with onshore products as a result of doing that impact analysis. And 71% said no. They will remain using offshore products in this jurisdiction. And I've had some interesting discussions with private equity managers over the last couple of weeks, actually, where in current fundraising, they've offered institutional investors the Malta option. And the institutional investors have responded by saying, well, who else is actually using the Malta product? The response then being nobody else. And they've continued to use the CI-based product. The other 29%, unclear at the moment, but we haven't seen any shift of business away from the island since April last year, with the exception of probably one case. But I think overall we have a lot of reasons to be positive. One of the other areas we need to be focused on is what are the important markets for our clients in terms of the private placement regime, and James will cover what that means in a moment. But we need to prioritize efforts around key markets in Europe. And not surprisingly, UK is important to our clients. But you can see there a fairly even flow in the first 10 in terms of areas that we need to focus on. And during the panel session, we'll talk to John Harris about how we're actually engaging with the regulators in those jurisdictions. So we needed to be able to identify how do we prioritize our efforts with onshore regulators to ensure that the private placement regime is protected in those jurisdictions. We also asked a question, how comfortable and how confident do you feel that Jersey will continue to meet the access criteria under the private placement regime? And 83% were very confident that we would actually continue to meet that criteria. The other thing we really need to do, though, is to think about what messages we're getting out to our clients and to the intermediaries using the island. And while a lot of us here are very clear on what the strategy is in terms of what we need to do next and how we're responding to AIFMD, I think we're probably at least on par with other locations. But I think we need to push messages out a lot more proactively. And I think it's great to see the number of people here today because I really want you guys to take those messages away and start talking to your clients. You might ask, well, what are the key messages? The first one is around Jersey will meet the criteria for ongoing access to EU institutional investors. And I think the feeling is that we're a better place to do it than most other offshore locations because we did a comparative analysis in terms of how confident they felt about other jurisdictions. They're more confident about this jurisdiction than others. We need to prioritize efforts in looking at ongoing access under the private placement regime. And as I said, James will explain what that means in a moment. We considered whether the island needed to implement a catch-all AIFMD regime. And what that means is fully compliant with everything in the AIFMD directive. Depository requirements, remuneration requirements. It's quite an extensive range of requirements within the directive. All clients and all people we spoke to basically said, do not introduce a catch-all regime, but please introduce an opt-in regime because there's a period of time over 2 years where we will not have access to a passport. And from a marketing perspective, we need to have the AIFMD compliant product on the shelf. And during the panel session, we'll explore that a little further and put that in context. We've identified the key European markets that we need to focus our efforts on. And I think on the communication side, as I've said already, we're at least on par, but I think we've got to do a little more in terms of getting that message out.